Hello and welcome back to another AHT Cloud training series. Today we will learn how to build highly scalable, top-performance custom APIs using Laravel Framework. I will be covering all topics and provide you an advanced architecture that you can use for all your future projects. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to my channel to stay up to date with my latest training videos. In this course, I expect that you have some basic knowledge in Laravel. You should be comfortable creating and running Laravel projects and setting up your own local database. If you don't know how to set up your own local environment, I recommend you watch my previous video, Laravel tutorial, Laravel setup. The link is in the description. Before we get started, I wanted to briefly give you an overview of this course and how it's layered out. The first part, I will briefly explain what MVC is, MVCS, and the repository pattern. Then we will learn how to build highly scalable CRUID APIs using the MVCS and the repository design pattern. If you don't know what those are, don't worry, we will cover it all in depth. It is also worth mentioning that we will not be using Eloquent. You can easily use it if you like, it will save you some time. But our goal here is to deliver top performance APIs, so we will be using raw SQL. After learning how to do it custom, you can easily use Eloquent, which will save you time again, and you can apply the same structure and the design pattern. MVC stands for Model View Controller. It is a common software design pattern that lets you separate your application logic into three layers: the model, the view, and the controller. The model is basically your data object. For example, if you have a web page where you're displaying a list of users, then the model would be the list of users. Then you have the view, which is your user interface. Then you have your controller. This is where you handle all your backend logic. The biggest problem with MVC design pattern is that it's not scalable. If you're literally just using a controller file to handle all your backend logic, you will easily bloat your code file, making it very difficult to scale and to extend. It will cost you a lot more time to develop and maintain in the long run. Testing will also be much more difficult. To resolve all these problems, we will be using the MVCS design pattern. MVCS stands for Model View Controller Service. The difference between an MVC and an MVCS is the addition of the service layer. The MVCS lets you separate your application logic into four parts. So you have the model, you have the view, you have the controller, and you have your service. The biggest difference of an MVCS and an MVC is, instead of writing all your code for your APIs inside your controller, you write it inside a service file. Your controller should only handle routing API calls to corresponding service and returns the response. Your service should handle all the actual logic. The repository pattern is a design pattern used for abstracting and encapsulating data access. The best way to understand the repository pattern is through an example. Let's say we're building an API endpoint to create a new student. So your front-end code will send a post request to your backend. Now, inside your Laravel project, you add the route inside your router file. Then from the router file, we map the post API endpoint to the corresponding student's controller. Then the student's controller would call the student's service. So let's say, for example, we have a create method. Inside the student service, you validate the incoming data, then you insert it into your database. As of now, this is what your request lifecycle would look like. By applying the repository pattern, we will need to add a new layer, which is called repository. This makes our API lifecycle look something like this. So here we have a new layer which is the repository file. In our example, it is called students repository. So we have the students controller, student service, then the students repository. The repository file handles any database related logic. This includes creating the actual records, editing, fetching, or basically running any query. The repository pattern states that only your service file can communicate with your repository. So in this example, only the student's service can communicate with the student's repository. So let's say we're building an endpoint to create a new student. Then the student service would basically call a method, let's say create inside the student's repository. You will not be able, or you should not use the student's repository in any controller or even any service that's not the student service. It's also worth to mention that no other service should call a repository other than the corresponding service. Don't worry if you don't understand this yet. Once we start coding, it will be very easy for you to grasp. For this tutorial, we're going to build multiple APIs to create, edit, and delete students, courses, and enrollments. The purpose is to provide you with a template that you can use for all your future API projects. You will learn how to structure your projects using MVCS and the repository pattern. To give you a quick demo, I will be using Postman for my API client. There are a lot of different APIs clients that you can use. I personally recommend you download Postman since it's a very good tool for API development. So in here, you can see the multiple APIs you're going to be creating. So first we have an authentication. We're going to be using Sanctum. Once that's done, we can use this token to authenticate with our API. So we're going to add it here, and I'm going to show you a few endpoints. So here we have students endpoints. Let's go ahead and create a new students. So you can see here the fields that I'm supplying is name and email. Now we also gonna implement a get API. So in here, let's go ahead and fetch the first student with ID 1. So you can see this is our newly created student. We can also delete, we can also create courses, delete courses, and fetch courses by ID. And for the enrollments, we have get by ID, we have a create enrollment, and we also have a soft delete. Now, let me show you how the backend actually looks like. So here is our Laravel project. You don't have to worry much if you cannot follow up with this, but we're gonna be implementing these endpoints. So I'm just giving you a quick overview. So all our requests begin inside our API. So here we have multiple APIs that we implemented. So we have a user, students, Sanctum, enrollments, and courses. Let's pick students, for example. And you can see here, we have our three routes: get, post, and delete. And it's all mapped to our students controller. So let's go ahead and see what's inside our controller. So here we have our students controller. And you can see this is our get method. And if you can take a quick look here, you realize that all our functions here look exactly the same. So take this for example: try, catch, exception, return the exception or the error, and here we return the response. Let's take the update. Same thing, we have our data variable that we extract from the request, and we return a new response. We also have a try and catch. If we have any error, we return our error here, and the same thing for the get. Now, if you see here the students controller, we are using or calling everything inside the student service. So in here, the student service, we have a get method, we have an update, we have a soft delete as well. So let's go ahead and see where those are. So I created a new folder called modules. We have common, core, modules, we have courses, enrollments, and students. So the common module just contains some abstract classes that we will be using or extending. And the core contains things like, for example, a generic file where we have all our success or all our HTTP response codes. So here, for example, success, the title is success, code 200, and this is our message. And you can always modify these later. And we have a helper function here, or class, static class to be more precise. Now, inside our module, we have, let's say, students. Let's take that for example. If you see here, we have our students model, students mapper, student service, and our students repository. We also have our students validator. Now, let's take the service for example, and you can see here, our service file is calling, let's take the get method for example. So it's calling our repository get method. And inside our repository, this is where we do all our querying. So this is just to give you a quick overview. You don't have to, we will be building this from scratch. So let's get started. If you already know how to set up a new Laravel project locally, feel free to skip this step. If you don't know how to set up a Laravel project, make sure to watch my previous video as I go in depth into that. Otherwise, I am running Laravel using Vagrant Homestead on Windows. If you're using the same setup as me, then you will need to modify your Homestead YAML file, and you will need to create a new site for your project. And you can see I did that here. I'm not gonna go in depth as this is all explained in my previous video. But here I am using this domain name. And this can be any domain that will only work locally. So I am using local.apimastercourse.com. If you're on Windows, you will need to update your hosts file. So you have to open Notepad and you have to do it in as an administrator. Otherwise, you will not be able to modify your host file. Your host file will be inside your C drive, Windows, System32, drivers, etc. And make sure to select all files here. And you can see the hosts file is right here. And so this host file contains two parts. The IP address, which is found inside your Homestead file here. You can see that's my IP address. And your domain name. Once you do these two, make sure to reload Vagrant. So you're gonna need to run, so you need to open the terminal and go inside your Homestead folder and run Vagrant reload provision. Now to create our new project, the first thing we want to do is we're gonna go inside our Vagrant box. So here I ran Vagrant SSH, and I'm gonna go inside the folder that I have configured for my project. So that's inside etc www code tutorial and API master course. And you can see right now this folder is empty. There is nothing here. So let's go ahead and create our new Laravel project. I'm pointing out this documentation for Laravel. I highly recommend that you give this a read. And this is where you will find a lot of useful documentation information about Laravel. So it's on Laravel's official website. We're using version 9. And in here, I'm installing my project via Composer. So basically, I'm just gonna copy this command. Before I do that, actually, I'm gonna have to reduce this name because it's very long for you to see. So I'm gonna just run export ps1 equal, and inside the brackets, I'm just gonna add this symbol, the arrowhead. So you can see now I changed this whole line into just this. So it will be easier for you to see. We're gonna run the composer, create project, Laravel /Laravel, and you can specify a folder name or a project name, and that will basically create a folder, or you can just use the dot and that will just create it in your current directory. and let that run. Once that's done, it's gonna look something like this. And make sure now to go ahead and open your project in Visual Code or whatever code editor that you're using. So I already have it here open. Now our second step is we're gonna be configuring our env file and env.example. So an env file is a text configuration file that lets you control all your environment constants. Your env file is very important since it contains a lot of credentials and other important information. If you're using Git, you should never store this file inside your code repository since anyone with unauthorized access can steal all your information and access your database, other servers, or any other API key that you have. The env.example file is used to track or to keep track of your environment constants. For the most part, you want to include all your variables here, but you don't want to actually set the values for them. This file is safe to store inside your repository. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna just clear this file out. And whenever, let's say, a new developer or a new person installs this project locally, they will have to copy the env.example file to their env and fill in the variables. So let's begin by setting up our first part. So the app name, app env, key, and debug. So I'm gonna copy this. I'm gonna place it here. For the app name, we're gonna use API master course. The app env is local. Let's keep this here. Let's set the debug to true. And the URL, let's just change this to local.apimastercourse.com. If you're using localhost, you can keep it. This is just for me. This is the what I want to use here. And let's make sure that this is consistent with here. And let's go ahead and set our database connection. So I'm using MySQL, and this is the right address, localhost, and 3306, that's right. The database name, API master course. Database username, I'm using Homestead, and secret. We will have to create this database. I'm just gonna copy this and I'm gonna place it here. This is safe to store in your Git because this is coming from your local box. But if these were actual credentials, like for, let's say, you have an AWS RDS instance, you should never store the information here. And let's keep that's it pretty much. We don't need the other fields. Our last step here is we want to just create our database. So I'm using HeidiSQL. It's a really good database client. And to connect to our database for our Vagrant box, we're gonna use the same information that we have inside our Homestead YAML file. So if you have this file, in the bottom there is ports that we map, and here we're mapping port 3306, and it's gonna be 3306 and 0 in the end. So let's keep that here. So our port is 33060, username Homestead, the password is secret, and the IP or host name is localhost or 127.0.0.1. And once we're connected, let's go ahead and create our new database. And we call the API master course. Once that's done, let's just make sure that this worked. So run PHP artisan migrate fresh. Let's see if that worked. And you can see that we do have some tables by default that Laravel has for us, and they were successfully created. If you have a connection error, make sure that you have the correct information set up inside your env for your database. Here we use 3306, and this is the local port, not the exposed. Our database design is going to be very simple. We are building an API to allow us to create students' courses and enroll students in courses. So we have 4 database tables. The courses table, we have 2 fields that we care about. It's the name and the capacity. The created at and updated at is a timestamp, and we add this to every single database table. So for the course, we have name and capacity. Capacity is the number of students that we can enroll in the course. Then for the students, we have 2 fields, name and email. And for the users, we only care about the email. And the students' courses enrollments table will allow us to enroll students and into courses. So we have 2 primary keys, actually 3. One for the course ID, one for the student ID, and one for the enrolled by user ID. To create the database tables, we will need to create a new migration. In Laravel, we can do that by using the php artisan migrate command. So in the terminal, if you write php artisan, you should be able to see all the available commands. And we want to use the make, so make migration. Now, let's go ahead and create the courses table. So we write php artisan make migration, and let's say courses. Now let's go ahead and create the students table, and let's do the same thing for students courses enrollments table. Now for the users table, by default Laravel already has a migration for us to use, so we will skip the users migration file, but I will create another migration called master seed. So this migration file will just provide us a basic master level seed for our database. So let's go ahead and create that. So let's call it master seed. And let's go ahead and check what happened to our project. So in our code editor, if you open the folder called databases or database, and in here you have a migrations folder. So you should be able to see all the migrations that we created. Now I'm just going to modify the master seed. Here I'm going to change the name of the file. I'm going to just write here, I'm going to change this 0 to 1. And the reason is I want this file to always be the last file in our migration list. It's optional, you don't need to do that, but it's much easier to find once you start having a lot of migrations. And here's the users table that Laravel provides us by default. Let's go ahead and create our courses table. So if we review back our design, courses has a name and a capacity. Capacity is an integer, name is a string. So in here, we will need to write schema, create, we can create a table. And in here, we want to create the table name courses. And we need to use the callback function. And if you don't have to memorize this, you can always just use another migration file. So you can just copy, for example, this from users. And let's go ahead and add it to our students. Let's just remove these fields here. And let's say students. Let's do the same thing for students enrollments. And so students courses enrollments. Now I will leave the master seed last. So for the courses, we need to have an ID. That's our primary ID. You're gonna almost need it for every single table you make. Then we need another column. Let's call it, so it's gonna be of type string, and we're gonna call it name. Then we need another column and the capacity. So capacity is a positive integer. You can't have like -25 or -10 students. So it's gonna be always unsigned integer. And so let's find integer. Let's call it capacity. Now let's also add another column called self deletes, which will give us a new column called deleted at. and it's going to be a Boolean column. And we can use this to enable soft deletes. And the last one is going to be a table, and let's say timestamps. And this will create the created at and updated at columns for us. These two. Now let's go ahead and create the students. So we need name and email. So let's just copy this because it's almost the same. So in here we have name and email. And let's leave email to be a string. For the students course enrollments, we have 3 keys that we're referencing. So let's go ahead here. Let me just minimize this. So we need the ID, of course. For our first primary key, courses ID is going to be an unsigned big integer. So unsigned means only positive numbers or integers. So let's call this students ID. And let's add one for courses ID. And let's add one by enrolled by users ID. And we're gonna also add the soft deletes here. And we're gonna add our timestamps. Now, these are only right now, they're only integers. So we need to establish that these are foreign keys. We do that by writing table and foreign. We reference the column name. So let's start with students ID. And we say that this column references ID on the table name. So it is called students. Now let's copy this for courses and enrollments. So the foreign key courses, and we have one for enrollments. And this one will reference courses table. And this one will reference the users table. Now for the master seed, all what we need is basically to create some users for our database. So let's say users seed value. I'm gonna just declare an array here. And you can add as many users as you like. I'm gonna add one for me. And the email is going to be support@ahtcloud.com. You can add any email and user you want. The password. So we're referencing this table. We need the name, the email, and we need the password. So the password, I'm going to have to use the bcrypt function. And I'm going to say my default password is password. This is obviously not safe. Don't do it. Add a more complicated one. But either way, this is going to be stored in your code. The whole purpose is you have one user. Once you create a new instance of your project locally, you can still log into the application. You can always change the password once you first log in. So the created at, I'm going to say now. And we're going to insert this inside our users table. So we use db. And we reference the table users. And here we want to insert the user seed value. And you can always add more values here. Now let's go ahead and run this migration. So I'm going to write PHP artisan migrate fresh. And looks like here I have a unexpected token. So let's see what happened. Line 22. Oops, I made a mistake here. You're not supposed to have a semicolon. It's supposed to be either a comma or nothing for the last entry in an array. So let's go ahead and run our migration file again, and you can see they all ran successfully. So let's go ahead and see what happened in our database. So in here, let me just refresh. So we have, let's say, users table. I can see I have one default user, and this is our other table, students course enrollments. And Where's the courses? Courses right here. There's just one more step that I forgot to do. And so let's go to the create users here. If you see, there's an up method and a down method. So if you run, for example, PHP artisan migrate or rollback, and you can roll back the migrations that you did. So this down would be responsible for that. So here you create a user table. Then here you want to do the opposite, delete the users table. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to go to courses and I'm going to also add the same logic here. So drop if exists and let's say the table name is courses. Let's do the same thing for students. And we need to do the same thing for students enrollments. I'm going to copy the name here. Now for this one, we need to delete the actual record that we created. To do that, it's very simple. We're going to first find all our users that have the emails that's specified in here. Actually, before we can even do that, we need to move this to the higher level of the class so we can use it inside here as well. So I'm going to copy this, erase it, and let's go ahead and declare it inside here. So it's a private variable. It's an array, and let's call it users seed value. And let's just set it to an empty array for now. So to declare the actual values inside or to initialize this array, we have to do it inside the construct. The reason why is because we are using the bcrypt and the now function, and these functions are not accessible outside the before the construct level, basically. So it has to be done inside the constructor or inside any method. You cannot use it in the global level here. And let's change this to point to this variable. Let's do the same thing here. All right. So inside here, we want to find all users wherein. Now, the wherein command will basically allow you to find all users that have a specific value for a column. So let's say we want to search by email. So we want the email to equal one of these values inside this array. So you can have multiple ones here. So just to demonstrate, you can simply copy this, and now we have two records. And let's say this is another email. Just erase that for now, and let's go back down here. Now, to get all the emails inside this array, we're gonna use the PHP array map method. So array map, and in this method, there is two parameters. So the first one is gonna be a callback function, and which will allow you to basically use each value inside your array and return a specific value from there. So instead of using a for loop, you can do this. And the second parameter is the actual array that we want to use. So in here, we want to return only the email. And once that's done, we want to just run delete on all of those values. This is an optional step, but I want to always encourage you to create and install and reset scripts for your projects. These scripts will save you a lot of time. If you messed up your local build, you can easily reset it or reinstall it without having to manually run all your commands. So the install script will basically run all the commands that we need to install our projects on a new computer. And the reset script is going to help us locally when we are developing to basically reset everything and start from scratch. For all your future projects, whatever command you need to run, make sure you add it to your scripts. To create these scripts, I'm going to add it in a new folder in our root directory for the project. So the top level. So let's go ahead and open the terminal. And inside the terminal, make sure we're inside our project. I'm going to create a new directory. Let's call it scripts. And we should be able to see it inside our code editor. So let's just refresh. And scripts right here. So now I'm going to create two new bash scripts. So we're using bash, and that's going to be just basic shell sh. And let's create a new one for the reset.sh. Now, if whenever you create a new bash file, the first line you need is always this, then sh. So let's go ahead and add this to both files. And if you were not able to run this file, you will need to give it permission. So I'm just going to write a note here. This is so the command will be chmod u plus x, and you have to write your script name. So in this case, it's install.sh. Let me just add this note to the reset file as well. So for the install scripts, I'm going to basically run first set up the project, then clear the cache. So let's do an echo. Setting up project. And that's just going to display on the terminal some information for us to know what progress we are so far. So first, let's clear the cache. So clearing cache. And we need to run php artisan clear. Clear. PHP artisan config clear, PHP artisan cache clear, and PHP artisan view clear. And let's run also the routes clear. Now our first step, we want to install all our composer dependencies. So let's say, let me erase this, installing dependencies. Okay, is that right? I don't think that's the right spelling. Let me double check. And we're gonna run composer install. And since we're running this through a script file, we have to use the no interaction flag. So what this does is sometimes composer will give you like a message and you have to write yes or no. So this will just prevent these and run this without any input required. Now, if you're using npm, which I'm not in this project, but you can always add npm install. Now, so we cleared our cache, we installed our dependencies. Now, I also need to check if we have a env file. If not, we will copy the env.example file and make it inside the env. So, create env if not exists. To do that in bash, it's simple. It's an if statement. And you use the if flag, and we need to know our current path for the project. So we need to know where our current directory is. So to do that, let's create a new variable. Let's call it path base, which is the base path for our directory for the project. And for this, to find this, we need to know the directory name for our current file. And we want to go back one level. So remember, this script is inside here. So the directory name will give us the route to this file. So it's going to be inside the scripts. We want to go back one level. So we are inside our root, our top level for the project. So let's use this here. So in here, we need to make sure that if we have an env file, so if this file exists, then we want to echo env file already exists. Else, let's echo creating env file. And let's let me just add a dot here. Let me add another dot here just for completeness. And let's copy our env file. So we do that by simply writing cp.env env.example, and we want to copy our example file and make it into our env file. Then let's close the if statement and let's give this a quick try. So I'm going to quickly just copy all the other fields that I missed, I left out in my env file. So I'm going to add it here. And we need to add all this as well. Let's go ahead and delete our env file and let's try this script. So inside the terminal, inside your project top level directory, I'm going to run inside the scripts the install. So we already have the dependencies installed when we first created the project from scratch. Laravel automatically installs them for you. But if you're trying to set this project on another computer, obviously these will not be installed. And we created our new env file. Let's just see. And it's right here. Now let me just try one more time. So this time we should not be creating any env file. It should just be doing nothing. So let's check that. And you can see here, env file already exists. We did nothing. Now let's go ahead and create our reset script. So this is the basic level for this script. Anytime you add a new, let's say for example, you're using a package called passport. So you will need to basically create your keys. Then you would add it inside here. So whatever you need to do in order to install your project, make sure you add it here. Now for the reset scripts, I'm going to copy the clear cache top part. And actually, let's leave this message here and say resetting. And let's go ahead and reset our database. So we want to run PHP artisan migrate fresh. And let's just quickly echo that. Dropping / recreating database. And let's leave it as that. And let's just echo done at the end. And I have a habit of always writing semicolons in the end, so don't do that. I'm gonna also add this here, echo done. So let's go ahead and try our reset script. So our reset script will basically just clear our cache and reset our database. If there are other tasks that you need to do, make sure you add it here. So let's go ahead and try that out. Reset. There are two different types of APIs. Ones that are available globally to anyone, and the other ones require authentication. For example, if you're implementing an API to login, the login API must be available to anyone, so there is no authentication required for that. In our case, we need to secure our students, courses, and enrollments APIs and prevent unauthorized access to it. We can do this in Laravel easily using Sanctum or Laravel Passport to issue API tokens. In this tutorial, we will use Laravel Sanctum. So the first thing we're gonna do is go to the terminal and make sure we're inside our project. And in here, we're going to run composer require Laravel / Sanctum. Once that's done, we will need to publish the Sanctum configuration and migration files using the vendor publish artisan command. So we will run PHP artisan vendor and publish. We need to specify the provider, and that's going to be the Laravel Sanctum service provider. Now let's run our migration. So we write PHP artisan migrate. before we can implement our authentication routes, we will need to configure our middlewares. So under app, go to HTTP and go to kernel. And in here, if you scroll down, you want to uncomment this line. Now we're going to implement our API route to allow us to authenticate to our server. So let's go ahead and create a new controller. So under HTTP, go to controllers. In here, let's go ahead and copy this controller and let's rename it and let's call it Sanctum controller.php. And let's rename the class name here. Let's remove all this and let's remove this as well. And now I'm going to also add declare strict types equal 1. Now we have an empty class here. For now, let's go ahead and create an empty method. So we're gonna create a function, and this is just going to we're gonna use it to issue the token. So let's call it issue token, and let's include request, and the request we're including is inside the HTTP. So we're gonna include this one, and we're gonna return a response, and that's also inside the HTTP. And for now, let's just return just an empty response just for now. And let's go ahead and create our API endpoint. So let's go ahead and scroll down, and we're gonna go to our routes folder. And here we're gonna create a new folder, and let's call it API. And in here, let's go ahead and create another file. Let's call this sanctum.php. And in here, we wanna use the word route, and we're gonna group. So we're gonna create a group of routes. And let's, oh yeah, I just need to add here, PHP. And let me just import the class name here. And so in the group, the first parameter is going to be your middleware. Since the login route is available globally, we have no middleware here. And to add our routes, we're gonna use a callback function. And in here, we can go ahead and add our routes. So I'm gonna add a post route. And let's say sanctum/token. And we're gonna map this URL to our Sanctum controller. And we're gonna use the issue token method. So that's our login route. Now we need to include this inside our API file. The problem is here, we don't want to write all our routes here manually, because this will just bloat this file and it will be very hard to keep in track of which route where. So I'm going to auto load all the routes that are placed inside here automatically inside the API file. So I'm gonna erase all this, and I'm gonna actually erase this as well. Now you can either require each file manually, so you can do something like this, require API sanctum.php, and this will work. This will include our route inside here, but this is not a very pleasant solution, especially once you start having a lot of different files here. So we can just automate this process by doing it automatically. So how we're gonna do that is, first we're gonna grab all the files inside this folder. So files is equal to, and we're gonna use the helper function, and we're going to use the magic variable here, and this will give us the current directory for this script. So we are inside here, API, and we need to go to our API folder. So right now we're inside routes. We need to go to the API folder, and we want to grab all the PHP files. So see how I have a star here? This will do all the PHP files. Now for each file, so for each files as file, we're just going to require that file. So require file. Actually, let me add the brackets. So require file. So this will do this automatically for us here. So we can add our routes without having to worry about adding them here manually. Now let's go ahead and give this a try. So our API route was sanctum/token. And depending how you set it up locally, if you're using localhost or not, I am using this address. So my route would look something like this. So I'm just going to copy this. And let's go back. All right, so let's go ahead and open Postman. And if you're using Postman for the first time, you will need to create a new collection for your project. So I'm gonna create a new collection, and this will contain all the routes for this project. I'm gonna call my collection API Master Course. And in here, I'm going to add a request. So we created a post request. And this is our route here. Let's just try this. Let's send. Let's see what happens. So if you see this error, the route group does not exist, this means that we used the wrong group. So let's go back to our Sanctum file inside our API. So this route, this group method, see here, it's coming from the routing. So this is a mistake that I did. It should be coming from the support facades. So if you just try this again, see here, we have multiple definitions. We want to make sure we select this one here. And let's give that a try right now and see how it goes. So see, we're getting an empty response and the status is 200 here, but let's just double check that this worked. So I'm going to go to my Sanctum controller and I'm just going to add a simple message. Hi. Let's see if it worked. And see, I can see my message here. So now we will need to actually authenticate our API. Now let's go back to our code. And the first thing we want to do is let's go ahead and uncollapse everything here. And let's go to app. In here, let's create a new folder. So let's call this modules. And in here, we want to create two folders, common, and let's create another one, core. Now for this tutorial, we're not really using the common folder, but it's good practice to have it. And if you have, like, let's say, for example, a module that's shared between other components, then it should go inside the common. Now let's go ahead and create ourselves a helper class. So we're gonna create a class for all our HTTP response codes and error response messaging. So inside the core, let's call it HTTP, or let's make it caps. So HTTP response codes.php. And let's start a PHP file here, declare strict. So strict types equal 1. And we need to add the namespace. So we are inside app, modules, and we're inside the core folder. So core. And we're declaring an abstract class. HTTP response codes. And in here, we're gonna just declare a bunch of constants and they will contain all our error messaging and HTTP response codes. So we have one for success. The title, for example, we're gonna set it to success. The code for our success is going to be 200. And we need to add a message, and let's say our default message is request has been successfully processed. Now let's we need to declare the other one, so let's copy this and let's paste it. So we're gonna declare another one for not found, and the title for this is not found error, and let's actually change this from caps to under lowercase. So not found is usually 404 status code, And the message, let's say, could not locate resource. We're gonna also need to do another one for invalid arguments. So invalid arguments. Title, let's say invalid arguments error. So we're gonna use a 404 for this, or you can actually use 400 as well. And here we're going to say invalid arguments, server failed to process your request. And let's create the last one, and let's say this one is bad request. And the error code for this is 400. Server failed to process your request. So these are just some defaults that we have. Now let's go ahead and go back to our Sanctum controller. So inside the app, controllers, and in here, I'm going to change the syntax a little bit. So the first thing I'm gonna do is add a try and catch block. Now, the reason why I add the try and catch block is I want to make sure that all our exceptions, if we have any, are not being displayed in our API responses. So because sometimes that will give like the whole log of where that error happened, and it could reveal some of your backend architecture and files, and it could give a lot of information that you don't want to give. So let's return a new response when we have an exception. And in here, our response is going to, so inside here, we're using the response class. So there's two parameters that we need to provide. The first one is the message, and the second one is the error code. And here we're gonna use the HTTP response codes, and I'm gonna use the bad request, the code there. So this is going to be code 400. So this is the same thing as writing 400 here like this, but this is not very ideal, especially when you start using it in different files. So in here, we're gonna pass in exception. So the exception type, so get class and the error. Then we're gonna paste the errors. This is optional. It's up to you how you want to handle it. I'm just showing you an example. Get message, and let's not forget to add our end of line terminator here. Now let's just try this out. Let's test it. So I'm gonna throw a new exception here, just for testing purposes. And this could be anything. So whatever error happens inside this catch and block, try and catch block, it will be handled here. So let's see how that will look like. Now we have an error here, and we can see that it's saying this class is not found. And I wanted to show you guys this error. So this class actually does exist, but the problem is we have a typo in the name. So the problem here is that it will not work because the class name, the file, is not the same as the one we declared here. So we're gonna need to fix that. And inside here, let's go ahead and change this as well. So let's just erase this, and let's write HTTP response codes. Now let's give this a try. And you can see here, let's use the pretty one. This is how our errors will look like. Let's go ahead and create our Sanctum service. So remember, we're using the MCSV pattern. So inside our modules, I'm gonna create a new folder. Let's call it Sanctum. Now in here, I'm going to create our service. So let's say Sanctum service.php. And I'm going to also create our Sanctum validator. So Sanctum validator.php. And so in order for us to authorize anyone with our API, they need to provide us 3 pieces of information. They need to provide us the email, the password, and the device. If you guys remember that we created inside our migrations a default master seed, and by default, we have a password that's just password, and this is our default email. So we need the email, password, and the device type. That's the optional one, but we will add it inside our validator. So let's start off with our Sanctum service class. So I'm gonna create a new PHP file here. Declare strict types equal 1. The namespace is going to equal app, modules, and Sanctum. Now for the class, let's call it Sanctum service. And for now, let's just create an empty function to issue the token. So public function, issue token. And in here, I'm gonna expect an array of data. So let's call it raw data. So this will be like the user, email, the password, and we're gonna return a string, which will be the token once it is authorized. So for now, I'm just gonna return an empty string or some gibberish. And I'm going to call this method inside our controller. So let's go back to our Sanctum controller. And in here, we need to add our Sanctum service. So we will do that by using dependency injection. And this is the way that I recommend. The reason why I always recommend you use dependency injection, because the other alternative would be to use the keyword new and create a new instance of your class. The problem with creating a new instance using the keyword new is that you will not be able to mock it using PHP unit. And this is a very big problem once you start doing testing. So let's declare a new variable here. It's going to be private, and let's call it. So it's going to be of type Sanctum service, and let's call it service. And inside our construct, so public function construct, we can add it here. So Sanctum service, and let's call it service. And let's initialize our variable. Now, once you include it here, Laravel automatically takes care of it, injecting it with dependency injection. So in here, we can go ahead and use it inside the issue token. So now let's go ahead inside here, our try block. And the first thing we want to do is we want to grab our data. So the request we have here, we're expecting to have some sort of data. So let's say data array, and it's gonna equal. So if the request to array method is not empty, then we're gonna assign it with the request to array method. If this is empty, then we're gonna use the request JSON all method. Now, let's erase this and let's call our service. So what we want to do is we want to return a new response. So return new response. And we have 2 parameters here, similar to the ones that we did here. The first will be our return value. The second is our status code. So for the return value, we're gonna return the issue token from the service. And let's supply the data array here. And we're gonna also use the HTTP response codes, and we're gonna use the success. The code is 200. This is pretty much it for our controller. Let's just give this a quick try and see how it's working so far. So I'm getting my response, and let's go ahead and implement our service. So back to our service, and let's search for it. So Sanctum service, and actually let's implement our validator first. All right, so I'm going to just copy all this here, and I'm going to change the class name to validator. I'm going to remove this method here. So I'm going to add a new method and let's call it validate issue token. And in here, I'm going to use Laravel validator. So validator is equal to validator. And we have two parameters. So the first parameter is going to be your data. The second parameter is your set of rules. So my first rule is email is required, and it's going to be of type email. Password is also required, and it's a string. And we also need the device, which is also required, and it's a string. Now, actually here, this is going to be void. We're not returning anything. Now, if the validator fails, then we're going to throw new invalid argument exception. And in here, we're going to encode our errors. So validator errors, and let's grab all of them. And you don't need to add this here. Let me just... So that should be it for the validator. Let's add it to our service. So in here, we're gonna need to do the same thing. We're gonna need to add our validator through dependency injection. Never use the keyword new. So private Sanctum validator. And let's add it inside our construct. So we have our validator. Let's initialize it. Now, in here, I'm going to call the validator. So this validator, and let's call the validate issue token method, and let's give it the data. Now, if there is any error that happens, the validator will throw the exception, invalid arguments exception. Let's give this a try. I know we didn't send any data here, so we should see some errors, and we do. So if you see here, the email field is required, the password field is required, the device field is required. Let's go ahead and add those. So if you're using Postman, you want to go to body here, you want to select raw, make sure on the right here you select JSON, and let's go ahead and add our information. So we need the email field. So email was support@ahtcloud.com. The user, what do we need? The password was password. And the device, let's just say Postman. So let's send this and see what happens. And our validator passed. So we're getting our return value here. So let's go back to our service here. And the first thing I want to do is I want to declare a new model for our request. And I always recommend you do this because you don't want to use array values. So see how we have an array here? Because we are using an array, we don't really know what type of variables there are. So you could just do something like if array key exists and start making if statements to check if values exist or not. But the better solution would be to actually declare a model for it. So let's go ahead and create a new file. So I'm going to copy the service and let's say Sanctum authorize request.php. And I'm going to also create a mapper for this. So I'm going to copy the same file and I'm going to call it Sanctum authorize request mapper. So let's go and start with the authorize request. And in here, let's rename our class name. And I'm going to erase all these three and this one as well. So we're going to have three private variables. One for the email, one for the password, one for the device. Now inside our constructor, we're gonna pass in these values. So we have a string for email, we have a string for password, and we have a string for device. And let's go ahead and initialize these variables. Now I'm going to add a bunch of getter functions. So since these are private, you can't just use them. You need to use them through a get method. So let's say public function get email. It's going to return a string email. Let's do the same thing for the password. And let's do the same thing for the device. All right. Now let's go ahead and create our mapper. So the mapper is going to be a static class. So I'm going to copy this name here. And we're going to have, let's erase all this, a public static function map from, and we're going to give it an array. And this will return a Sanctum authorize request. Let's implement this method, and in here it's simple, just return new Sanctum authorize request, and we're gonna supply the parameters here. So we have our email. Let's copy this. So second one was password, third one was device. So let's go back to our service here, and now we can grab our data here. So we can say data is equal to Sanctum authorize request mapper map from, and let's give it the raw data. So the first thing we want to do is we're going to use this information to look up the user. So far we know that information is present and it is in correct format, but we don't know if it is if it exists as a user. So let's go back to our service and let's use Eloquent here. So this is the only exception that I make to using basically querying things inside your service. You should always have a repository for that, but this is just way too small that it's not worth the effort. We will do it for all the other classes, but here we're gonna make an exception because it's literally just one line. I'm trying to just make this course a little bit shorter. All right, so this is our user. So user. So we're basically querying the user model where the email field is equal to the email from our coming from our data. So let me just fix this. Now, if the user does not exist, so the user does not exist, and or actually the hash is incorrect. So let's check that. So the hash, and the hash is coming from, let me just import this from the support facade. So we're going to use the hash check, and we're going to check the password, and we're going to compare it to the user stored hash. Now, if the user does not exist, or if the hash is incorrect, we're gonna throw an error. So let's say validation. Actually, let's just say bad request. Bad request exception. And let's just say the provided credentials are incorrect. So let's give this a try. I'm going to go back to my... so if this is... before we try it, so if this is true, then we have an error. Otherwise, we want to actually create our API token. So let's just do that. And we're going to use the Laravel create token method. It's already implemented by default. And we're going to return the plain text token. So plain text token. That's a variable. Hope I spelled it right. So let's just see. Yeah, let's give this a try. So I'm going to make a mistake in my password. So I'm just going to add a bunch of A's here and we should see the error. So we can see the provided credentials are incorrect. Now let's try the right password. And here we go. We have our API token. Now let's go ahead and create our students module. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to pull out the migration for the students to use as reference. See here, we have ID, name, email, we have a deleted @ column, and we have created @ and updated @. You can confirm this by looking into your actual database. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a model for this. So let's go inside apps. So inside modules, and in here let's create a new module and let's call this students. And I'm going to create a new file and let's call it students.php. The model is going to always have to be a representation of what the record would look like in the database. So all the columns here, we need to have them defined as well in our model. So let's get started by writing PHP here to declare that this is a PHP file. Let's add declare strict types equal 1. And our namespace is going to be under app, modules, and students. So the class name is going to be students. Now, the same thing that we did with the Sanctum authorized request, we need to have also a mapper for it. So it's going to have a bunch of variables here that are private and a getters, set of getters for each single one. So let's go ahead and do that. We have a private, and the ID is always nullable because you have two cases, the created and before you create it. Before you create it, the ID is null, it doesn't exist. But that's why it's nullable here. And we have a private string name, private string email, and the deleted @ is basically a nullable column. That's a string that contains a timestamp when the record was deleted. If it is null, it means that the record was not deleted. And let's add the created @ it's required. Oops. And let's add the updated @ and updated @ is nullable as well. And let's go ahead and initialize these in our constructor. So we have ID, name, email, deleted @ and we have also created @ and updated @. Now let's go ahead and initialize these. And I'm just going to copy this. Now let's go ahead and add the get methods for these. So public function just see the types here. So this is a nullable int. So get ID. And let's just make a copy of this, and the name one, get name. Here we're gonna return name. We need one for email. Deleted at, created at, and let's do the one for updated at. And let's go ahead and fix these types here. So this is a string. Email is going to also be a string. Deleted at is a nullable string, and both of these are just strings. Now, in addition to these get methods, I'm going to add two more getter functions, and they're going to be very helpful for all the models that we have in the future. So the first one is going to be toArray, and this will return an array representation of this model. And this we will be using it inside our controller or service when we return the value. Now let's go ahead and copy this method and let's add a new one. And now this one is going to be called toSQL. So it's the same thing as this one, but here the key names has to be the same key names that we have in our database. So let's go back to our migration file, and name and email are correct and ID is correct, but these have to match what we have in our database. So in here, if we go to our students table, we see deleted at has an underscore. Same thing for created at and updated at. So let's go ahead and do that. Now let's go ahead and create a mapper for our model. And actually, let me make this capitalized S, so students. And this one will be students mapper. And let's copy this. And let me make sure I have the right spelling here. So I made a mistake. Let me change that. So students. And inside the mapper, let's erase all this. And let's declare the map from function. So this is a very helpful function that makes it very easy for us to map values and declare instance from our model. And it's going to return students. All right. So we have our ID. And it would be helpful if we have this on the other screen. So I'm just going to put it here. And we need to match the constructor here. So first one is ID, and name, email, and the other ones. Name, email, deleted at, created at, and updated at. Now there is one more thing we need to do. So the deleted at is null. So this value might or might not exist. So we will have to use this operator, which basically says, if this key does not exist in the array, so this value does not exist, we will use this value. So with this idea, you can assign multiple values. For the created at, if you see here, it's always required, but it's actually not required from the user. So if someone is sending an API request and he doesn't have to set the created I field, we have to do that. So we're going to say if this does not exist, we will create it basically. So we're gonna create a new date in this format. Hour, I and S, so minutes and seconds. All right. Now the ID, same thing. It is nullable here. It's a null or integer. Just like we did for the deleted at, we're gonna add this operator and say null. So if ID doesn't exist in our array, we will assign null instead. Now there is another step that we're gonna do, and we're gonna need to convert ID to an integer. We just can't go ahead and typecast this. So if we do something like this, it's not gonna work, because if this failed, it will still try to cast it. So the best way to do this is to create a helper method. Now, whenever you have a method that you might be using in other places as well, it's a good idea to have it in a shareable place where you can easily use it for other modules. So under the core, or actually let's do it under the common, we're gonna add a new file and let's call it myhelpers.php. Let's go ahead and declare this file. So it's a PHP file. Declare strict types equal 1. And let's give this the namespace. It's going to be under app, modules, common. And it's going to be an abstract class, my helpers. And we're going to have a function here. And let's call it null string to int. And in here, we're going to pass in a string or a variable. We don't know the type. It can be either a null, a string, or an integer. And we're going to return always a nullable int. So if the string does not equal null, then we return the integer version of it. So we convert it into an integer. Otherwise, we just return null. Now let's go back to our mapper. And in here, we want to just grab all this. And we want to use that helper method. Now let's go ahead and create our service file. So I'm going to copy the students model and let's call it students service.php. And let's copy this name here and let's initialize this class. I'm going to erase all this. And just for now, we're going to revisit this file. I'm just going to create 4 empty functions. The first function is going to be get. So public function get. And this function will allow us to fetch students by ID. So we're going to require an integer ID. And we're going to return a students model. Now, if you guys never seen this symbol before, so what this is basically saying the return type of this method will be of type students. Now let's go ahead and create another method, but maybe we want to grab a list of students that are enrolled in a course. So public function get by course ID. We require an integer course ID, and we're gonna return an array of students. So whenever you have a very vague type like array like this, I recommend you type hint it inside here. So I'm gonna remove this. In here, instead of using array, you're going to write students and the array brackets. This will type hint this array. Now let's add 2 more methods. One is going to be for our update endpoint. And once we update the record, we want to return it. So it's going to return a student's model. And finally, let's do another function for soft delete. And we're going to need the ID of the model that we're going to delete. And we're going to return a boolean, whether it's true, deleted, or false. So for now, these are all empty. Let's not worry about it. Let's go ahead and create our controller. So inside HTTP, here we have controllers. And let's copy the Sanctum controller, rename it to students controller. And we're going to need to import the student service here. And let's do that same thing here. So for this, let's just go ahead and create our handlers for our endpoints. So we have a get endpoint. It's going to return a response. For now, let's leave it empty. We have another one for update. And we're going to also return a response. And we have one for soft deletes. So let's go ahead and create that. All right. Now let's go ahead and declare our API endpoints. So let's minimize all this and let's go to our routes folder inside the API. Let's copy the Sanctum and let's add students here. So for the middleware, we need to make sure that these endpoints are authenticated with Sanctum. Now we're going to have a post endpoint and it's going to be API/students. Let's go ahead and reference the students controller. And to create students, we're going to use the update method. Let's do the same thing for get, copy paste. And get is going to be the get method. Finally, the delete, we're going to reference the soft delete method. Now let's go ahead and implement these. So let's go back to our students controller. And for the get method, we're going to always have the same syntax. Try, catch, exception. And we're going to return a response if we have an exception here. All right, and the code is going to be a bad request. So HTTP response codes. All right. So the controller, all what it's going to do for here is call the service. So it's going to return a new response. And the response is going to come from the service get method. All right, now this is failing here because we need to supply the ID. Let's go ahead and do that. And let's copy this. And let's do the update. So the update is going to be a little bit different because we have data coming in from a form or from our API. So we're going to do the same thing that we did for the Sanctum here. I'm going to actually just copy this. And we're gonna here change this to update. And that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and do the soft delete one. And we're gonna here change the reference to the soft delete method. All right, now let's go ahead and implement these methods. Inside our service, let's begin with our update method. So the first step we're gonna need to do is create a validator so we can validate this data here. So let's go ahead and copy this service file and let's call it students validator. And let's change the name here. And let's go ahead and erase all this. So we're going to declare a new public function. And let's call it validate update. And we're going to give it an array of data. And this function is not going to return anything. The same thing that we did for the Sanctum. Let's actually go back here and copy it. And let's go ahead and add it here. And I think you don't need this. You don't need this. It will work without. And then let's change the data. Let's pull this class invalid argument exception. It's right here. Now, for our validation, we're gonna require both the name and the email for the students. So the name is required, and the email is also a required string. Let's do this email here. And let's add string rule to our name as well, because we don't want to have integers for names. And let's go ahead and add this validator into our service. So in here, we're going to declare a new private variable. It's going to be of type students validator. And we're going to have to initialize it through the constructor so we can use dependency injection here. So students validator. And let's assign our validator this value. All right. So for our update method, the first thing we're going to do is validate our endpoint. So this validator, validate update, and let's go ahead and validate our data. So now past this point, we know that our data is valid. Now, because we're using the repository pattern, we can't go ahead and use Eloquent here or Query Builder or whatever access to a database. We have to use that inside the repository file. So I'm going to create a new file here. Let's copy the service file and let's call it students repository. All right. Let's copy this and let's add it here. And let's go ahead and declare this class. So I'm going to erase all this. So for the repository file, it's a good idea to have some variables. So table name is going to be students. And private, let's say, select columns are going to be all the columns that we're going to select from our database. So if we go back to our database here, we have ID, name, email, deleted at, created at, and updated at. So we're going to have to add them all here. So I'm going to do students.id. This is my SQL. Students.name. Students.email. Students.deleted at. As deleted at. Just so we can be consistent with our convention. Students.created at. As created at. And let's go ahead and do the students.updated at. All right. Now we're gonna need to implement our update method here. Let's go ahead and do that. So public function update, and in here we want to update with a new students object. So let's call it student. All right, and we're gonna return the corresponding students once we create or update. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm going to return a transaction. So what transactions allow you to do is if you have multiple queries at the same time going to your database, and let's say the first one passed but the last one failed, then we want to make sure that we roll back all our changes. And we can do that by using the transaction here and writing all our queries inside here. So let me just pull class name here. All right. So the insert is very simple. We're gonna use the DB table, and we're gonna reference the table name, which is here. So this is students. We're gonna update or insert. And we're gonna update or insert if the ID exists. So let's say student get ID. So if the ID is not null, it's gonna basically update. If the ID is null, it's going to create. And in here, let's go ahead and use the toArray method in our model. So this will update a record for us. Once we create or update our value, let's go ahead and grab the ID of that object. So I'm gonna say the ID is gonna equal the student's ID if it equals null, or if it equals 0, then we're going to grab the last inserted ID. So what this statement does is say if the ID is null or 0, then we know that this is a newly created record. And we can go ahead and use the Laravel helper methods to grab the last inserted ID. And we do that by using PDO last inserted ID. So last insert ID. Or if the ID has a value, if it is not null and it is not 0, then let's just return that ID. So students get ID. All right. Now we have our ID. We need to return our newly created record. So we're gonna return this. Let's create a new method called get by ID. So this method is really simple. Let's go ahead and create public function get. Requires an integer ID and it's gonna return a student. All right. So in SQL, if you wanna fetch a record, it's really easy. So let's say, for example, select star from students where students.id is equal, for example, 1. So this is the same query that we're gonna build right now. It's very simple. So our select columns are right here. So we're gonna implode them. Implode, and we're gonna separate them by comma. All right. So what this does is it's gonna grab all these and add them side by side and split them with a comma. So we get our select columns, and let's go ahead and query our result. Let's just remove this. So I'm gonna use JSON decode and JSON encode. And the reason why I do this, so that we can convert whatever results that coming from the database is not a collection, rather it's gonna be an array. So it's gonna go down like db select one, and we have select columns from the table name where ID is equal to ID. And let's remember that we have a deleted at field. So we need to make sure that deleted at is null. Otherwise, if it is deleted, you can't grab it. So we just implemented this query here. So let's add that here. All right. This is what we implemented here. And let's go ahead and check if our result is null. That means this record does not exist. So we're gonna throw new exception. Let's say the message is going to be invalid student ID. Now, if the result exists, we're just going to return a student's object. So we do that by using the student's mapper, map from the result. All right. So, oops, this ID here, we forgot to bind the ID. So we just need to bind it here. ID. All right. So we actually implemented both the update and the get method. Let's go ahead and update our file here. So in here, let's go ahead and add our repository. So private students repository. All right. And let's go ahead and add that to our constructor. And let's initialize this variable. All right. And in here, we're going to return that value from our repository. So repository, we're going to call the update method and we're going to pass the data. But actually, we're not going to pass the data. We're going to have to pass a student's object. So we're going to have to use the student's mapper, map from, and let's go ahead and use our data here. So we've completed our update. Before we give this a try, let's just go ahead and implement our get. It's very easy. We're just going to return this repository get. All right. Since we got that far, might as well just implement the soft delete method. So here, it's going to be very simple. We're just going to return that soft delete method inside our repository. Now we didn't have this implemented, so let's go ahead and implement that method. So I'm going to go back to our repository here and let's go ahead and declare a new method. Soft delete. Integer is the parameter, and we're going to return boolean true or false, whether it's deleted or not. So it's going to be very easy to do. We use the DB table and we want to use this table name, which is students, where the student's ID is matching to this ID. And we want to also make sure that the deleted at is also null, because we can't delete something that's already deleted, right? And we want to update here. So if this record exists, we want to update our deleted at field. So we're going to set the deleted at to the current timestamp. So that's going to be date, and we're going to specify our format. All right. Now the last method left is the get course by ID. And this is very easy to do. Let's go ahead and just do that in our repository first. I'm going to copy. Let me add the semicolon here. And we forgot to actually return our value. So I'm going to say if result does not equal 1, we're going to throw a new exception. Otherwise, we're going to just return true. All right. Now for the get course by ID. So get by course ID. And we're going to return an array. Do I already have this declared? I don't know why I thought I have it, but I don't. So let's grab the select columns. Same thing that we did for the get selectable columns. And actually, might as well just copy the whole get method but we're gonna just have to modify it a little bit. So in here, select columns from table, but instead of using our ID for students, we're gonna need to reference the course ID. So let's just work this SQL out first. I'm gonna open my database client and let me show you. So we're gonna do select star from students, and actually let's join. So we're gonna join. So remember, students are enrolled in courses inside the table called students course enrollments, and inside this table we have course ID here. We can use the course ID or the student ID to get our results. So back to our query. So we're gonna join the students courses enrollments table on, I'm going to copy this. So we're gonna join this on the course ID. Where was it? So courses ID is equal, let's just write 1 for now, where the student's ID is equal to the same student ID inside the student's course enrollments table. And let's make sure that this is also deleted. So the deleted at is null. So we have to make sure that we are not fetching deleted records. All right. Now, if we run this, you'll realize that this table, this query will return multiple results, not one. So let's just copy this for now. And let's go back to our code editor and let's paste it here. Let's change the select and add our select columns. All right. So select columns from students where, so we're gonna need to change the one that we added here, and let's just add course ID and let's bind the value. All right. Now this will return an array. So the best way to do this is to say if the results, so if count results are equal to 0, we're gonna throw a new exception and we're gonna say student not enrolled in any, not enrolled, no students enrolled. Otherwise, if we have some results, then let's use the PHP map method to create a student's object for each result. So we can easily use the map method. Remember, we have a callback function with row, which is going to be the individual results in the returned array. Oh yeah, and let's forget not to change this to, so select one will give you one result, but this will get you more than one result. So in here, let's go ahead and use the results. And we want to make sure that we return the student's mapper, map from method and row. All right, we implemented the get course by ID. Let's go ahead and add that to our service. That's pretty much it. We should be done. Let's go ahead and test these endpoints out. So I'm going to open Postman. And actually, I forgot the route names. So let me just grab that. So let me open the students API routes. All right. So let's start off with the create. So back to Postman, and I'm going to create a new request. So first, let me rename this to auth. Save this old route, and I'm going to add a new request here. So add request, and let's call it get. And I'm going to copy the same route here as my auth, but I'm going to change this to student. All right. And let's change this to post, and let's try. All right. So whenever you see this error, it's saying route login is not defined. Now, the reason why route login is not defined is because in our middleware, when you don't supply the authorization header that you get from the auth, then it's going to redirect you to your login route. We need to change this, but let's do that. I don't want to extend this course longer. So let's just go ahead and grab this token from here. And you can easily go to authorization. In here, you select barrier token and you add it here. So let's try that now. We're getting this error here, and it's saying that the return value of our update method inside our controller should be of type response that we have hinted, but we're returning JSON response instead. So let's go ahead and fix that. So let's go back to our controller file. And so these errors are generated because of these type hints, and these are good errors. We want these errors to happen. That's why we type hint. So the problem here is inside our update method, we're using response JSON. Instead of doing this, we should just return new response. So I'm going to change that here. And I think I also used it in the soft delete. And I think I also used it inside the get. Yeah, these should be new response. Now this should work. Let's give this a try. And it's saying the name field is required, the email field is required. That's our validation. So it's working. Let's go ahead and add those fields. So if you're using Postman, click on body, go to raw, switch text to JSON. And let's go ahead and add name. And I'm gonna say emad z. And for the email, let's say just some gibberish. For now, let's send this request. All right, we're saying undefined array key updated at or updated. So let's check where this was used. Now, this is a good error as well. So let's go back to our mapper method. So students mapper. And here we have updated. It should be updated at. All right, let's send this. All right, so if updated at does not exist, was it nullable? Let's just double check. So let's go back to our student model, and updated at was nullable. So we forgot to do that here. Let's make sure we have it here as well. And let's go back to our mapper and add null for this. All right, now let's try. All right, and it's saying that the database transaction does not exist. This is coming from our repository. This is most likely due to namespace. So we used the wrong namespace maybe. Let's see. So where is the transaction? And we did it inside the update. So TRANS. We made a spelling mistake, I guess. So transaction should be like that. Let me copy this. Let's paste it here. So now this should be defined. All right. So it's saying column not found, deleted at in the field. Now, if you take a look here, you see that for some reason, deleted at looks like this. It should be underscore deleted at. The same thing for created at and updated at. I know this is going to be inside our repository. And if we go to our update method, see here, we're using toArray method. We should use the toSQL method. Now that should work. So let's give this a shot. Looks like we have another error, and this is a very easy to fix. So it's saying basically the student's mapper argument 1 data must be of type array, but we given it std class instead. So this is why you want to always use type hinting, because you want these errors to happen. All right, let's fix that. So inside our get method, see how we have JSON decode and JSON encode. Now the JSON decode has a parameter and it's Boolean. If you set it to true, it will return an associative array. So we need to use that. So in here, we're just gonna need to add true. So let's copy this and do the same thing for the rest. So we use the inside the get course by ID. All right, and we use the inside, let's see, soft delete, nope, and update, no. So that should be it. Let's give this a try. All right, and argument 1 must be of type string. We have given a model instead, so let's check this. So let's go back to our controller, and this is happening because in here we're returning an instance of courses. So remember, the get is returning students. Therefore, we need to use the toArray method here, toArray, to return in our data fields as an array. Now let's do the same thing here. So update, then toArray, and that's it. Let's try this out. So let's go back to Postman and let's try. Here we go. It's working now. So let me create 2 records. All right. Now let's try the get route. So this was actually the create. And in here, let's organize this in a better way. So let's create a new folder and let's call this students. So I'm gonna rename it students. And I'm gonna add our create method here. And let's duplicate this and let's rename it, and let's say this is the get method. So for the create, it's post. For the get, let's copy this. It's going to be the same thing here, except we're gonna need an ID. So let's just say 1. Now, we did not add the authorization header. If you're using Postman, there is this really nice feature that you don't need to write the header every single time for each single API request. Imagine when you change the token, you're gonna have to change it for all your requests here. So what do? Is inside authorization, you wanna select the inherit auth from parent. Let's do the same thing here for the create. And let's save these requests. Now, let's go ahead and grab ourselves a new token. And instead of adding the tokens for your requests, you're gonna add it for the whole folder here. So you're gonna select your project and you're gonna select here barrier token and you're gonna add it here. Now, once you add it here, all of them are gonna inherit it. So let's give this a try. So we're getting a not found error 404, and we know that the students get method works. So let's check out our route file. So inside our router file for students, so the get student by ID, we just need to add the ID here. And we forgot to do the same thing for the delete. Let's do that. Oops, let's change this. Now let's give this a try. So get student 2, and you can see here our get method works. Let's try an ID that doesn't work. And we get our error, invalid student's ID. Now let's go ahead and duplicate this as well. And we're going to rename this and let's say delete. So let's try our soft delete. And let's go ahead and delete student ID 2. Where's delete? Right here. Delete. And it's saying that deleted null is not found. So I guess we made a mistake in the name here. It should be deleted at, not deleted null. So let's go back to our repository. Students repository here. Scroll all the way down to the soft delete. Where is soft delete? Right here. And this deleted at should be deleted at, not null. Now let's give this a try. So it worked. We have one. That's true. Now let's try to get that student, or let's try to delete again. We should get an error, right? Let's try to do get for student ID 2. We should also get an error. Yeah. So far, we have created our students' endpoints, and we have also created our authentication endpoints. Now, let's go ahead and do our courses. So I'm gonna go to modules, and I'm gonna copy the students folder, and I'm gonna create a new one, and let's call it courses. And we will need to rename all these files. So the students model is going to be called courses model. We're going to add the courses mapper, the courses repository, courses service, and the courses validator. So we'll start off by implementing the model first. Before we go ahead and do that, let's look at our migration quickly and see the fields that we need. So I'm gonna go to databases, migrations, and I'm gonna go to the courses migration table. And see here we have name and capacity. So if we compare this to students, we only have, so the students has name and email, courses, name and capacity. So the difference is one field, email. So it's good that we copied that file so we can save a lot of time by just using the same values. So let's go to courses, let's go to here, and we want to change email to capacity. And capacity was an integer. All right. And I'm going to also add another field. And this one, we're not going to return it in our toSQL method. So this is only for the toArray method, and it's more of a helper, a variable. So I'm going to say total students enrolled. And this will help us once we start creating enrollments. All right. So I'm going to change the email here to capacity. And this was an int. And before I forget, let's go ahead and change the classes names. So students mapper becomes courses mapper. Students repository becomes courses repository. Student service becomes courses service, and the same thing with the validator. Back to the model, and let's continue on changing the capacity to email. So here to array, we're gonna change the email to SQL, and get email is gonna return an integer. All right, that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and add our total students enrolled. So in here, I'm gonna add int and total students enrolled. And let's return that inside our array. And we're gonna leave it out from the toSQL because it's not a real column. But let's go ahead and add the helper function for that. So get total students enrolled. And that's gonna return an integer. All right, so we have the model down. Let's go ahead and do the mapper. So I'm gonna keep this open on the side, and let's go to the mapper. And the mapper is going to return courses. So we're gonna return a new course. And in here we have ID, we have name as well, and this one becomes capacity. And let's go ahead and add the total students enrolled. Now, if we don't have this field, I'm just going to add 0. And that should be it. All right. Now let's go ahead and implement our service. So let's close this. And let's go back to courses service. And in here, we want to change the... Actually, let's keep this for now. Let's just go ahead and update. So the get method is going to be the same. We just need to change this to courses. The update method is going to be exactly the same. Where is that? Right here. So I'm going to remove this. And here we're going to return courses. And instead of mapping with the students, we're going to map with the courses. And also I forgot to change the namespace. So let's go ahead and do that. So here we're going to change the namespace from students to courses. All right, that's pretty much it. And in here, the validator, let's go ahead and change those to as well to point to the courses. Validator and repository. That's inside the service. Let's go ahead and do the repository. Let's see. No, that's good. Let's see. The validator is also good, except the namespace. All right. So that's pretty much it. Let's go ahead and implement our repository. So the table name here is courses. We have to change as well all of these. All right. So for the email, we're going to change it to capacity and we're going to add a new one. Now, this is going to be a subquery. All right. So we're going to select count star. So we're going to count the number of rows in this subquery from enrollments, where enrollments.courses_id is equal to courses.id and enrollments.deleted@ is null. Now let's go ahead and update our functions here. So the get is going to return courses instead, and this code is not going to change. It's 100% the same, except for here we're going to say invalid courses ID, and we're going to use the courses mapper instead of the students. For the update, it's the same exact thing. We're going to use courses here, and none of this will change. The same thing with the soft delete, except for the exception here. We're going to say invalid courses ID. And finally, let's remove this function since we're not using it. Now, let's go ahead and update our service. Actually, that's done. Let's update our validator. So we have name and we have capacity. Both of these are required. Capacity is going to be a required string. Actually, let's say integer. All right. Now let's go ahead and implement our controller. So I'm going to go to HTTP controllers. Let's copy the students controllers and let's call it courses controller. And in here, let's do this in a bit faster way. So I'm going to replace all the keywords students and make sure to select match case. And we're going to replace that with courses. So we have 4 places. And that updates the file for us here. Now let's go ahead and implement our API endpoints. So inside routes, I'm going to copy students and I'm going to call it courses. And here, I'm going to just change these to courses, the route name. Now this should be done. Let's go ahead and give it a try. So I'm going to open my Postman and I'll just copy this folder for students. We're going to duplicate it. And in here, let's rename it and let's call it courses. Now for the create method, we're going to change it to courses. And here you go. Actually, I forgot to change this as well. So we need to change the controller. All right, so courses controller. And the same thing here. And we are keeping the same method names. So update, get, and soft delete. So let's go ahead and give this a try. And see here, we have an error that says the capacity field is required. So we know that it's working. Let's change this to capacity, and let's give this a course name. So let's just say math. So we're gonna create a new math course, and the capacity is only 2 students. All right, so we have an error that says enrollments does not exist, and that's because I made a mistake. So it's not enrollments, we called it, so the table was called, let me just go find the migration. Database, migrations, we called it students courses enrollments. So let's go back to our repository, and let's just change this to student course enrollments. All right. Actually, this one will stay course ID. And let's change this one. So this looks right. Let's give this a try. All right. And we did create our course. Total students enrolled are 0. That's correct. Let's create another one for science. And the ID is 3. So let's go ahead and test the get. So I'm gonna change the students here to courses, and let's just say ID 3. And we got the course here. Let's try an invalid ID. I should get an error. And invalid courses ID. That's done. Let's try the soft delete. Change to courses, and let's submit this. So this does not look right. Let's see what's happening here. Oh yeah, we need to change this route to delete, because we were just using the get. So let's save all these and let's submit. All right, deleted. Now let's try again, and invalid course ID. So we're done with courses. All right, so enrollments right now is going to be our last endpoints. So let's go ahead and go to modules, and let's copy courses, and let's call it students courses enrollments. And let's just open up the migration for the enrollments just for reference. So it's right here. So we have 3 foreign keys, and created at, updated at, and deleted at. And all right, that looks right. So let's go back to our new module. And let's begin with the model. So I'm gonna copy the name here, and we're gonna do the same thing. We're gonna replace all occurrences of courses with students courses enrollments. All right, now here is a shortcut I want to show you guys. So instead of going into each file and replacing these manually, we'll just do Control-Shift-H, and we will replace. So we're gonna search for courses and make sure to turn the match case on, and we want to include this inside the app modules students courses enrollments. So it was a students course. Make sure to have the right path here, otherwise you're gonna be changing all the other directories that are irrelevant. So we want to change all here. We're gonna change it to students courses enrollments. Let's go ahead and do that, and you can see here the namespace is done for us. This is done. It's mostly all done for us. Now we just have to actually implement the fields. So let's start with the model, and in here we have the ID, and we're gonna have another ID for the students. So students ID, and we have another ID for the courses ID, and the last ID is for the enrolled by user. So enrolled by users ID. And let's go ahead and erase all these. All right. So let's do the same thing here. And let's go ahead and do the same thing here. So we're going to replace name with student's ID. capacity with student's ID and enrolled by user's ID. Let's update our getter methods. So get student's ID is going to return an integer. And we also have get courses ID, which is also going to return an integer. And the last one is enrolled by user's ID. So get enrolled by user's ID. And that's going to return an integer. All right. Let's go ahead and update our toSQL into array method. So here we have student's ID, we have courses ID, and we have enrolled by user's ID. Now let's go ahead and update our toSQL method. So I'm going to replace the name and capacity with these three. And we're going to change these to underscores just to be consistent with our SQL or tables definitions of these columns. So user's ID. And that should be it for the model. Now let's go ahead and implement our mapper. So I'm going to put this on the side and we're going to open our mapper file here. Actually, let's close it. It's already open here. So we have the ID. We have here, we need the student's ID. Then we need the courses ID. Then we need the enrolled by user's ID. So let's add that here. And let's remove this. Now let's go ahead and close these and we will be implementing our service. So let's find our students enrollment service. Actually, let's do the repository first. So the first thing I'm going to do is we are going to change the statements here. So we called ours students courses enrollments. That's our table name. Let's update that. Now for the select, we're going to select the ID. We're going to select the student's ID as student's ID with no underscore. And we're going to do the same thing for the courses ID. So courses ID as courses ID. And the last one is going to be for the enrolled by user ID. So let's add that here. Enrolled by user's ID. And let's change that. Enrolled by user's ID. And let's remove this select. All right. So the get is going to look exactly the same. It's not going to change. Might as well just copy the name here. So invalid students courses enrollments ID. Let's update our update method. And looks right. And the soft delete is still the same, except for this part. I'm going to just change it here. All right. So now we have our repository down. Let's go ahead and check on our service. All right. So I will have to make a change here. So the enrolled by user's ID is not a value that will be set by or will be coming by the API. We will have to manually add it. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say data is going to equal array merge. And I'm going to add our current data variable. And I'm going to add a new array. And I'm going to say enrolled by user's ID. So I'm going to add this value to whatever incoming data we have. And we're going to be using the support facade for the auth, and we're gonna pull the authorized user's ID. So this is a helper function for Laravel. So whenever you have a user that's authenticated, this method will return the user model. That's the eloquent model. So let's grab the ID here. We put it inside the update, and that should be it. Let's go ahead and update our validator. So here we're gonna actually have to do a database validation as well. So let's start off by checking on the IDs. So student's ID is required. It must be an integer and it must exist inside the table students with the ID. Let's copy this 3 times. One for the course's ID, one for the enrolled by user's ID. So the same thing here. The ID must exist inside the courses table and the ID must exist inside the users. All right, that should be it for the validation here, but we do need to add some database validation. We need to check if the enrollment is under the capacity. So since each course is limited, we need to double check that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to create a new validator. And let's call this database validator. And let's change the file name here. Now, for this validator, what we're gonna do is we're going to require the users, the courses service. So we're gonna declare a new variable, courses service, and let's call this courses service. And we will need to initialize this variable inside our constructor via dependency injection, just like we did for the other fields. And courses service. All right. Now we will need to add the new method here. Let's call it validate update. And for this one, we're gonna need 2 fields. We're gonna need the course ID and we're gonna also need the student ID. And this is not gonna return any value, so let's make it void. All right. So the first thing is we're gonna get the course by ID. So course, you call this, we're gonna use the course service and we're gonna get the course by ID. And let's just fix this typo here. So it's supposed to be courses ID and students is supposed to be students ID. So now we have the course. So the first thing is we're gonna do check if course get total students enrolled is less than or equal to the course get capacity. I guess we haven't implemented the, did we do the get capacity? So let's go back inside our courses model. Looks like we don't have a get method for the capacity. We forgot to change it here. So get capacity. And let's go back here. So yeah, this worked now. So if this happened, then we're gonna throw a new exception. Invalid argument. And let's say failed to enroll students. Course enrollment limit reached. And it might be helpful to include the limits here. So let's copy this. And we have our message here. Now let's go ahead and make sure that the same student is not duplicated. So no duplicates allowed. Now to check for duplicates, we already implemented this. So if we go back to our students repository, if you see we have a get by course ID. So we can use this function. But actually before we do, let's change this to return an empty array. So if this is true, instead of throwing an exception, we want to return an empty array. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's add it here. So we're going to need to use our student service. All right, and let's copy this. All right. So let's check one more time. So let's go back to our student service. And in here, if you guys took a look, we looped through the results. So we're returning an array of students. So we will need to loop through the results here. So let's say for I equal to 0, I is less than count. And let's go ahead and fetch these results. So let's say students enrolled is equal to the student service get by course ID, and let's go ahead and grab the course ID. So courses ID here. So if the results are greater than 0, we're gonna loop through all of them and we're gonna check. So if the students enrolled at I, and we have the method get ID for the student is equal to the student's ID, then we're going to throw an error and say that the student already registered. All right. So let's add our database validation inside our enrollment validator. So in here, I'm gonna add a new variable, private, students of type students, courses, enrollments, database validator, and I'm gonna just say DB validator. Now we're going to initialize this inside our constructor. So public function, construct, I'm gonna copy this. Actually, let's copy this whole line. And we're going to assign our database validator variable. All right. Now in here, we're just going to call our update method inside our DB validator. So validate update, and we're gonna need to give it the course ID. So let's just make sure we have the right order. So courses ID first, students ID second. And let's do the same thing here. All right. And that should be it for the validators. We're pretty much done. Let's go ahead and create our controller. So I'm going to create a new file. Let's call it students courses enrollments controller.php. And I'm just gonna copy the courses stuff here. Let's replace the keyword courses with students courses enrollments. All right. So the get method should be the same, the update method, and the soft delete. So that should be it. Now we need to create our API endpoints. Let's go ahead and do that. So let's go inside our routes file and let's copy the courses. And we're gonna call it enrollments. And in here, let's go ahead and change courses to enrollments. And here, let's change this to students, courses, enrollments, controller. Did I not change? Oh yeah, it's right here. Okay, perfect. And that should be it. Let's go ahead and test this. So I'm gonna open Postman and let's go ahead and copy our courses folder. I'm gonna rename it and I'm gonna call it enrollments. And let's begin with the create method. So we need to change this to enrollments. Let's see what happens. The student's ID is required. The course's ID is required. Perfect. We have no error on the first run. So let's go ahead and add these fields. So student's ID. I'm going to try first an ID that might work. So let's try one. And the courses ID, I hope those work. Courses ID, 1 as well. Let's see what happens. All right, so the selected student's ID is invalid and the course ID is invalid. So let's go ahead and open up our database and let's find a suitable ID to use. So I'm gonna find the students table, and then here we can use ID 3, that would work. It's not deleted. And let's find one for courses. All right, so we can use ID 3 math or science. Math is already deleted. So it was 3. All right, let's try this. Now here we have an error, and the error says that there is a syntax error near this symbol. So if I were to read the query, we're selecting students ID and we're joining students courses on student courses enrollments.courses is equal. So here's the mistake. This is supposed to be equal here. It's missing. So this is inside our students repository. This is inside the get by course ID, and in here, if you see, we're missing an equal sign. So let's go ahead and add that. Now let's run our request again. And it worked. So we enrolled the student. Let's try to enroll them again. And failed to enroll student. Student already registered. Let's try our get. So and that's index 1. Worked. Let's try the delete. Oh yeah, we have to change courses to enrollments, and this should work. It's deleted. Let's try again, and we cannot delete it again. Perfect, it worked, and this should sum it up. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this tutorial useful. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel to stay up to date with my training videos. If you guys have any questions, feel free to post it down on the comment below, and we will see you on the next video.